Attila Laszlo is on his way to a meeting. Driving from his hometown of Békéscsaba along country roads to get there. Laszlo believes Hungary is under threat, and he's appointed himself one of the protectors of the land. The people he's meeting here are potential recruits to the Hungarian self-defense movement. We're not allowed to film the meeting. The self-styled Civil Defense Group was formed 2 years ago to replace another, outlawed by the courts for interfering with the rights of minorities, mainly the Roma. We made the 3-hour drive south from Budapest to meet with Laszlo earlier in the day. He was the only hardline nationalist we contacted willing to be interviewed without trying to lay conditions on our report. He's not ashamed of his opinions, far from it.
It's not a question of suspicion. Statistics, based on experience, very often show that 9 out of 10 crimes would be committed by gypsies. Is it genetic? Tradition?
Hardly new attitudes in the realm of the extreme right. But they've been given new life here by the refugee crisis, shifting focus to the tens of thousands of migrants who passed through Hungary last year in a bid to reach Western Europe.
They attack women, they're impolite, they're violent, they're messy and dirty. There was danger of an epidemic.
Laszlo and his recruits went to the border with Serbia to help protect it from migrants.
Sometimes we took them from the forest to give them to the police. These are civic actions.
In his world, detaining and transporting people against their will is perfectly legal, an obligation, in fact. When I ask him if he's a racist, he seems surprised.
Me? I don't judge people based on their race. I just judge people the way I see them. But it's a fact that some people belonging to a specific race, either the gypsies or today's migrants, specifically commit crimes.
The Buda side of the Danube River in Budapest, dominated by a huge statue of Saint Gellert, an 11th century Christian martyr said to have met his end at the hands of pagans. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has declared himself the great defender of Christianity in Europe, refusing to accept EU refugee quotas, in large part because so many are Muslim.
We know how these things go. First, we allow them to tell us whom we take in. Then they force us to serve foreigners in our own country.
Orbán's critics say it's xenophobic rhetoric like this that's giving extremism and intolerance in Hungary the oxygen they need to breathe. He built a fence to keep migrants out and called a referendum this fall on EU plans to resettle 1,294 refugees in Hungary.
A bevándorlási válság kezdete óta
He spent millions of dollars on fear-mongering advertisements like this one, urging voters to say no.
Szavazzunk nemmel október 2-án.
Voter turnout wasn't high enough to make it binding, but nearly 98% of those who did cast a ballot backed the government.
Many Hungarians will tell you that one of the reasons why they struggle with foreigners or outsiders is because they spent so many years behind the Iron Curtain, living in a confined and pretty homogenous world.
The country has just marked the 60th anniversary of the Hungarian uprising, eventually put down with brutal force by the Soviet Union and sending an estimated 200,000 Hungarian refugees to the West. Now, Hungary stands accused of forgetting its own past, but the government insists it's not the same.
It's a completely different historical and political environment.
Zoltán Kovács is the Prime Minister's spokesman.
Those over 200,000 Hungarians who've left the country trying to escape dictatorship and Russian or Soviet tanks were running indeed for their lives to the neighboring country. They stopped there. They followed all the rules.
In fact, many moved on from Austria, resettled in other parts of Europe, even Canada. Along the Danube again, a smattering of shoes strewn along the cobblestones as if blown there by the wind. Some have messages tucked inside, written in Hebrew. They are in fact a memorial to the Jews who were forced to take their shoes off by the river back in 1944 by Hungarian fascists, who then shot them. Andras Heisler's uncle was a rare survivor. He says today, Hungarian Jews still face an alarming degree of hate speech, echoes of which, he said, could be heard in the government's referendum campaign.
We made it clear from the very beginning that our community won't accept generating hatred against minorities, be it gays, gypsies, Jews, migrants, Muslims. Preaching hatred, it's like a virus. It spreads fast and unobserved.
Heisler is the president of the Federation of Jewish Communities in Hungary. He's also been a recipient of one of Hungary's Order of Merit awards. He recently returned it because the Orbán government this year gave it to a journalist close to the Prime Minister, known for his anti-Roma and anti-Semitic writings.
I saw that I wouldn't like to be in the same company with a man who has Nazi ideas. That's why I gave back my medal to the government.
More than 500,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered in the death camps of the Second World War. Today, Budapest is still home to the largest synagogue in Europe, and the government says there is a great renaissance of Jewish culture. But many who study and pray here say anti-Semitism is on the rise. Daniel Ruda says he's begun to feel self-conscious wearing his kippah at work, that his mother in the countryside has been taunted for being Jewish. Gabor Primer is 61, an archivist at the Jewish Museum. He believes the climate in Hungary is similar to that documented in the 1930s, and he connects it to the refugee crisis.
The refugees passed through, but the hate that they provoked in part of society stayed here in Hungary.
There is a hard beauty to Budapest in the fall, one that defies the constant grey and seems capable of banishing any dark corners. But the refugee crisis and the debate it's provoked has brought Hungary into sharp conflict with the European Union it so eagerly joined back in 2004, a final symbolic step away from its former Soviet masters. The government's recalcitrance on refugee quotas isn't the only thing causing disquiet in Brussels. These are the men and women of Hungary's last major independent newspaper, Nemzet Újság, working at a secret location in Budapest after they were dismissed en masse last month, the owner closing the print edition, citing financial losses. None of the reporters believe it. They say their coverage of politicians and government institutions dipped in the ink of corruption is a more likely answer.
It's not a random newspaper, but it was the most influential daily newspaper in our country, and I think it's about freedom of speech and about free press.
The government denies involvement, but since 2010, Orbán has tightened controls over state media, while oligarchs close to the government have moved into the private sphere.
Yes, it's still a free country, but it's in certain areas there's less and less freedom and more self-censorship.
Critics also accuse Orbán of curbing the independence of the judiciary, and some in the EU have suggested that Hungary be stripped of its funding if it continues down a more authoritarian road.
Despite all the anti-EU rhetoric by the government here in Budapest, Hungary still gets far more out of the EU budget than it puts in. About 95% of all public investment here is co-financed by the EU. The government says withdrawing it would be blackmail aimed at forcing Hungary to take refugees it doesn't want. And the country is nowhere near a crossroads. The main opposition party here, deemed even more discriminatory and authoritarian than Orbán's governing Fidesz party,